Thanks everybody for joining in tonight's webinar. We will do an overview of our recent Equine Science Society Symposium, take some of those abstracts, some of that research that was presented that I think is really pertinent to the end user, and how that science can help us to educate our clients and better help other horse owners and sell our products. Also, just want to touch a little bit on heat stroke and heat stress in horses. So real quick, we'll go over the heat stress first, and then we'll dig into the science. And again, I apologize for those that were on last month, but I really do think this is important. So the signs of heat stress, and like I said, most of us have been going through some really, really hot weather. Breathing rate higher than and heart rate is faster than about 60 breaths per minute when we're watching them breathe. They're really panting, trying to dissipate some of that heat. Reduce feed and water intake, rectal temperature above 103 degrees Fahrenheit, increased heart rate, profuse sweating. But the worst thing is, okay, if you have a horse that is profusely sweating and then all of a sudden they stop sweating, that means we're about to have organ failure, and that's really bad. Their ears will start droopy. Horses' ears should not be droopy. So if they've got droopy ears, something really bad is going on. Restless, lethargic, or even just a really depressed demeanor. I mean, most of us know what it's like when we get really hot. We don't want to do anything. If they're not drinking enough or they are sweating, that potentially cannot drink enough to combat what they're losing in sweat. If we do that skin pinch test, so just kind of above the shoulder on the neck, you pull the skin up, and if it takes too long for it to go back down, it means the horse is dehydrated. We can also put our thumb on the gum underneath the top lip and measure the capillary refill time. I've got that on an infographic. But muscle cramping, colic-like symptoms, these are all signs of heat stress. What's really, really interesting is the amount of heat that's produced during exercise. And this particular study that I was looking at looked at just the metabolic heat. So we know when we exercise, we get hot because we're burning calories, and that a byproduct of that is creating heat. So not only is it hot outside, but when we're riding our horses, they are internally creating extra heat that they have to get rid of. So when our thoroughbred racehorses during racing, they can rapidly elevate their core body temperature by 1 degree centigrade per minute. So we're riding for an hour. I mean, they can really increase their body temperature. And then if it's really hot outside and if it's humid, they just cannot dissipate that heat, and they will start to struggle very quickly. When environmental conditions are hot and humid, the normal physiological cooling mechanisms, they just become ineffective, because one of the biggest ways to cool horses is the evaporative cooling. And if it's really humid in the environment, then we're not able to actually evaporate that water off them. The heat accumulated may exceed a critical thermal maximum, which is about 106, 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we get over that, then we're talking about organ failure and death. Once we get to that point, it's a syndrome that has been labeled exertional heat illness, or EHI. Now, we have incorporated ingredients into some of our products that will actually help with heat stress. We've got chromium, but horses are at higher risk of heat stress if they're not exercised, if they're not conditioned and fit, if they're overweight, if they're older, even just horses standing in a field if they can't find shade, or if they're in trailers that are poorly ventilated or stalls, really heavily muscled animals as well, because all of those muscles produce more metabolic heat. And then also if we maybe we live in Vermont and then we take our horses to Florida, or you take your horse to hot weather and they're not acclimated to it, then that can be very detrimental. So horses dissipate heat, several mechanisms, but they push all the blood away from their internal organs and they push it to the skin, because then they're closer to that body evaporative cooling on the skin surface. So sweating is eliminating about 70% of the heat generated by exercise, and then breathing rapidly or panting will eliminate up to about 15% of that heat load. So you can see if most of our heat is going out with sweating, but if it's really, really humid and they can't sweat properly, then we have just blocked 70% of their ability to cool themselves. Just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit is a normal rectal temperature. 101 to 103 is normal for exercise. Over 103 or above, it is overheating, and then greater than 106 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're looking at heat stroke and all of those kind of detrimental effects that I just talked about. Now, we often talk about the horse heat index, and it's adding temperature to humidity. And the value you get is what we call this heat index. And when you add those two values up and they are above certain amounts, then we need to change the way we're exercising. So if the temperature plus the relative humidity score is 130 or less, then we have low risk and do whatever you want. 131 to 150, medium risk. We should take more breaks for cooling. 151 to 180, very high risk, light work only, ride in the morning, ride at night, ride indoors with fans. If those two values are greater than 180, danger, take the day off, do not ride, do not go out in the heat, make sure they have plenty of water, cooling fans, that kind of thing. Now, there's oftentimes horses and anything for that matter, there can be very strong opinions one way or another, and there seems to be strong opinions on how to cool horses. But I follow a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. David Marlin, and he is the world's leading expert on thermoregulation in horses. He is brought in by the Olympic Committee, the World Equestrian Games, all of the big endurance rides. They bring him in as an expert to monitor the temperature and monitor the well-being of the horses. He has worked actively in Tokyo because it's going to be very, very hot there, as it was in Atlanta for the Olympics. You know, we typically have the Olympics, and obviously they're in the summer, and it can be very, very hot in the places that they're held. So anyway, he's done a lot of research on how to cool horses, and one of the things that comes up a lot is do you scrape the water off your horse or do you leave the water on? And there are some old wives' tales or myths that, oh, if you leave the water on them and you don't scrape it off, then it'll boil on them. That is just insane. But if the outside temperature is less than 105 of 104 degrees, then whether you scrape them or you don't scrape them, it's kind of neither here nor there, but scraping them has no benefit. If the horse is hot after exercise, and this is not outside temperature, this is their body temperature, then we want to make sure that we don't scrape them. And one way that I explain this to people is when you get out of the shower and you're covered in water, if you had a fan that would blow on you, it would be freezing. As soon as you dry the water off, even though the fan's blowing on you, it's much, much better. So when you have a very hot horse, just keep running cold water on them. Do not scrape it off, just keep running cold water on them. And then when you turn them out or put them in the stall, don't scrape the water off, because the water is so much more effective at dissipating that heat. When it's cold and you want to keep the horse warm, absolutely scrape them, because you don't want them to dissipate that much heat. So chromium that we have added into several of our feeds, Chemin has done a lot of research looking at other livestock where heat stress has very measurable negative effects. So pigs, for example, in pig units, if they get hot, they get sick and die very quickly, just like chickens. And so this was looking at the rectal temperature and the respiration rate of pigs that either had been fed chromium or no chromium, either in a heat stress or a thermoneutral. So the yellow lines at the bottom, which was whether the control animals and the animals that had been fed chromium, but they were just in normal average temperatures that was not causing any stress. Then the orange bars, the solid lines, are the control that have no chromium in their diet, and then the dashed orange bars are the heat stress animals that had chromium in the diet. And you can see that rectal temperature is significantly lower in the animals with chromium, and the respiration rate is significantly lower in those pigs that were supplemented with chromium and put under heat stress conditions. And we know that this works in horses as well. Pigs, a lot of pig research actually translates to horse research because they're most similar. So, we have the Chemtrace Chromium in the racing formula, the e-boost paste, and also in the DAC metabolic. So if you have a horse that really struggles with heat, or you're competing in hotter parts of the year, then if you're not using the racing formula, then I would be inclined to add in the DAC metabolic. It's not going to negatively affect your horse if your horse doesn't have kind of metabolic issues. So with that, we will move on to the research. And I thought this was a really great research paper to start with. All of the research from our equine science meeting is always published in the Journal of Equine Veterinary Science. And I thought I'd show this one first because it's the safety of chromium propionate, which is the Chemtrace Chromium, as a source of supplemental chromium for horses. Because not only do we only utilize ingredients that are scientifically backed, but they're scientifically backed to be safe as well. And we know that the Chemtrace Chromium is the only FDA approved chromium for use in horses, but it's FDA approved at 4 milligrams per day. This study shows safety and efficacy at 2 times the FDA rate. So you're up into 8 milligrams a day, and there is no negative effects on these animals. Other research, and this research is kind of all over the place. There's no real theme. I haven't kind of grouped them all, but omega-3 fatty acids was a popular trend at this symposium. So feeding stalled horses a diet high in omega-3 fatty acids results in plasma fatty acid profile similar to horses on pasture. Because you think wild horses eat pasture, and if horses are meant to have certain nutrients, then they should be able to get them out of pasture. Now we know that we exercise horses and we make them have more babies than they probably would if they were in the wild, and they live longer. So their requirements for these nutrients get higher and higher as we're doing more with them. But what can we feed stalled horses that will at least give them a baseline of the amount of fatty acids that they would get on pasture? And so this supplement was high in omega-3 fatty acids, and it increased the omega-3 in the blood, similar to levels seen in horses at pasture. How long did it take to see that? Because that's always a common question that I get. 60 days to see results. Now, this was a plant-based form of omega-3 fatty acid, and we know that the marine-based forms of omega-3 fatty acids are even more effective. So we've got the DHA Perform, the Breeders Excel, and the oil all have the omega-3 fatty acids in them. And if we're looking to increase omega-3s in the blood, and we start feeding one of these supplements, how long would it take? About 60 days to see full results. Another trend for research was on cannabidiol or CBD and hemp use in horses. And to date, there's very little research on effectiveness or safety. And so I figured I would show some of that because, again, we have not jumped on the CBD bandwagon. We are monitoring all of the research, and we're actively investigating, but we need to be looking at the research as we're going on. So safety and behavioral effects of cannabidiol applied as an oral administration in horses. It was a single administration of CBD. They were given 250 milligrams per adult horse, so 1,000 to 1,250 pound horse, and there were no adverse effects. So this study didn't really measure whether it actually did anything. They wanted to just first make sure it's not going to have any negative effects on the horse. It's not going to cause any behavioral changes, make them nervous. It wasn't going to increase appetite per se, or any of those. There was going to be no adverse, no increased heart rate, no increased temperature, that kind of thing. And so that's what we need to monitor. And these are some of the first studies to look at that in horses. So well, we're certainly feeling more confident about going forward in this market. Another study looked at cannabidiol in the horse effects on movement and reactivity. So, we've kind of set the stage that one group had looked at a certain amount and said, okay, we saw no negative effects on the horse. Now, can we actually see that it might do something in the horse, effect on, a lot of times people think about CBD/hemp products altering behavior and potentially calming the horse. And so the way we measure that in science is looking at their reactivity to stimulus. So there's growing research in rats, dogs, cats, and humans, but still very limited in horses. This study extended the CBD treatment length of time and looked at reactivity. So it wasn't just a single dose, high dose, to see what would happen. It was, okay, we're going to feed it for 6 weeks. And the horses that were fed this amount of CBD were slightly less reactive than the control animals. Now, I think if we look at this amount, 100 milligrams compared to the 250 milligrams given in this safety study, maybe we are also able to evaluate dosage rate that might be most accurate for horses as well. Evaluation on the occurrence of gastritis in foals during weaning. So gastritis is just an inflammation of the gastric mucosa, that stomach lining, and it's very common in foals, and it can negatively affect foals. But the study wanted to look at foals weaned in paddocks versus stalls. Are we able to change their recovery rate? There was no difference in their gastritis scores before weaning. We know that weaning increases stress, and all foals, whether they were in the paddocks or stalls, developed lesions. But the foals in the paddock recovered faster than the stalled foals. So they had more room to move around. They were in a little herd. They were able to potentially chew more, maybe on little nubs of grass. So they were less stressed. So if weaning foals in stalls is our only option, and we know that transient kind of stomach ulcers really can be a problem, then a calming supplement like our Calm B paste or powder may help, as well as using something like the Cubitt or the pre-buff, knowing that it doesn't last a long time. Putting them out in a paddock is very helpful, but if that's not practical and we have to use stalls, then what can we use in our arsenal to help them? So Calm B paste, Cubitt or pre-buff, those things can help. I also often get asked about, what should I feed first? Should I feed my hay or my grain first? And if it's based on, what are our goals here? Then this study really showed, and I've seen some others that have shown the same thing. Feeding order really did influence stomach emptying. And you think, well, why do we want the stomach to empty slower or faster? And we want the food to slowly migrate through the digestive system so that at every point it's being digested so that we're getting more nutrients out of the feed. I thought that was a really good study because most of our clients do actually feed a hay oat diet. So feeding hay before oats definitely slowed down stomach emptying. Feeding oats before hay sped up stomach emptying. So where possible, get your clients to feed hay first. That's pretty easy to do if you go out to the barn and you throw hay to everybody, and then you go and mix up all your feeds and your supplements. If it's practical, then that's a good thing that you can do. I also thought this was very interesting, looking at the incidence of soft tissue injury and hours of daily paddock turnout in our, and when it says non-elite performance horses, it means, our non-top level race horses, or, horses going to the Olympic Games, which is the majority of our horses, right? So soft tissue injury to tendon, ligament, whatever, muscular tissue accounts for about 13 to 18% of horses that require rest, time off, and is responsible for 33% of training losses and wastage in sport horses of all disciplines. If the horse is in pain, then and you're running a training facility, then he's on stall rest, and you've just lost a day of training, but you're still keeping that horse. Baseline fitness has been suggested to contribute to horses' increased risk of soft tissue injury. So baseline fitness is what you get just from walking around the field. 50%, and this was the results were very, very interesting. So 50% of horses turned out for less than 12 hours a day experienced soft tissue damage. 25% of horses that were turned out for more than 12 hours a day experienced significantly less soft tissue damage. I should have clarified that there. So what can we do? I think that it goes to show that a little more exercise, more baseline fitness, not necessarily being constantly doing, let's say you do barrel racing or you do reining or whatever, and there are certain exercises that we do all the time that are specific to that discipline, but just that basic functional fitness. If your horses can't get a lot of turnout, maybe you're in a boarding facility where there isn't a lot of turnout, and you want to decrease the risk of that soft tissue injury, then build into that training program days of just functional fitness, walk, trot, canter, and getting them fit. Now, what other supplements may help with that? Something like the natural vitamin E, the E natural, is going to help with muscle recovery and tension and stiffness. And if you're really tight, then chances are you're more likely to pull something or damage something. So when our muscles are loose and supple and soft, which they will more likely be if they've got adequate amounts of natural vitamin E, then I think we can decrease the risk of that soft tissue damage, even though we may not have as much turnout with our horses. The study looked at the effect of marine-derived calcium on fecal pH, so hindgut pH. Now, marine source calcium, that's the calcite that I've talked a lot about that we have in the cool gut and in the pre-buff and in the colt grower. And I've always maintained that, okay, it really works well in the stomach. It's going to buffer stomach acid because that's where all of the research had pointed us in the past. But this study actually looked at hindgut or fecal pH and showed that it actually is getting to the hindgut and it's able to buffer that hindgut acidity. So that's pretty impressive. We built the cool gut so that it would work in the stomach and the hindgut. And now knowing that not only is that calcite working in the stomach, but it's also helping with the hindgut. And then the pre-buff, it's working in the stomach and it's working in the hindgut to help that acidity. So I think that this was one of the most interesting studies to see that it really is making it to the hindgut as well and helping with the buffering. This was interesting because I constantly get asked about different supplements, weird herbs and things that might help with glucose and insulin dynamics. Will they, help my horse with metabolic issues, with insulin resistance, with laminitis, with a crusty neck? And someone said I should try this or that. And so this one specifically looked at aloe vera and grapeseed extract. Now, I can say that I've actually never been asked about these two with regard to insulin and glucose in horses, but obviously these researchers had enough that they wanted to test it. And they did find that neither of these, either aloe vera or grapeseed extract, had any effect on insulin and glucose regulation in horses, but they did say, which we know, that high sugar and starch diets negatively impact insulin in horses. So if you have a horse with issues with sugar sensitivity or metabolic syndrome or crusty neck or any of those, want to keep the sugars and starches in the diet low. And our supplement, the DAC Metabolic, has research that is tested and proven that it 100% will positively affect the insulin in the horse. Late gestation supplementation of certain fatty acids, will they affect the foal? And so they're talking about docosahexaenoic acid, which is the DHA. We have DHA Perform and we have the Breeders Excel. Both products are very high in DHA. And so if we feed dams, mothers, a DHA supplement throughout their pregnancy, will it do anything positive or negative to the baby? So maternal supplementation of omega-3 fatty acids during gestation, pregnancy, has a variety of benefits on the dam and the resulting offspring. One of the most important is decreasing the time it takes for that foal to stand and suckle. So the faster they're getting up and nursing, the faster they're, getting strong and nursing that milk and getting that colostrum and helping to boost that immune system. Those foals also at birth had increased immune status. This study also showed that using a marine-derived omega-3 fatty acid, like fish oil or the algal form, the DHA that we use, increased foal plasma DHA much more than flax. So again, we have the DHA Perform and the Breeders Excel. So any breeders out there should be, or folks that have clients that have brood mares, should be recommending that those mares also be supplemented with DHA Perform or Breeders Excel. I thought this was interesting because it actually looked at a competitive supplement and looked at the chondroprotective, so joint cartilage protection effect of an omega-3 fat supplement in a cartilage model looking at inflammation. So it was actually the Equine Omega Complete. And it's touted to decrease cartilage breakdown in the joint. And this study showed no effect on cell viability. So it didn't stop these cartilage cells from dying. Another very interesting study, probiotic administration post-foaling may reduce parasite shedding in foals. So data from studies in humans and production animals have indicated that certain probiotics may interfere with the physiology of parasites, reducing the overall parasite load. We know these babies, they're laying a lot, maybe they're in herds, they can, they don't have a great immune system, they might easily be burdened with parasites. So the study at 2 days post-foaling, 2 times a day for 8 days. So the foals were 2 days old when they started this, and twice a day for 8 days, they gave them a probiotic paste, very similar to our probiotic paste. And the study indicated that the administration of this paste to otherwise identically managed groups of foals did reduce their overall parasite load. So that's another interesting use for the probiotic paste. Ours is very concentrated, and I think it's 5 cc's for a foal. So if you have your horses in herds and parasites or slow growth rates have been an issue in the past, then you may recommend that and especially if you're foaling out, or if you're foaling in areas where there may be a higher parasite load, that we use the probiotic paste from 2 days old through to 10 days old, really it would be, because we're doing it for 8 days, twice a day, give them 5 cc's. And that will certainly help boost their gut bacteria, but it can also help with parasite load. Another question I get a lot is about hair samples. And, I did a hair sample in my horse and he has high this or low that. And you know me, I have never been one to back hair tests, and I'm still not. But this study actually looked at correlated blood variables and blood levels and mane hair and compared them. There was absolutely no correlation between what was in the blood and what was in the hair for trace minerals, which we know. But what was very interesting is that across all treatments, black hair had higher concentrations of selenium and lower concentrations of zinc than chestnut hair. So hair color will influence the mineral deposits in your horse's mane. So, you know, it is not a good source for testing mineral status in your animal. And finally, back to kind of the very, very hot weather, and I mentioned a couple of tests that you can do on your horses. You know, you can do that capillary refill time, and if the skin snaps back into place in 2 seconds or less, then the horse is hydrated. But if it takes 3 seconds or more, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, then the horse is dehydrated and we need to do something. We need to add some electrolyte, add some salt, get them to drink. If we, oh, I'm sorry, I was reading it backwards. So that's the capillary refill time. Takes longer than 3 seconds than the dehydrated, but the skin pinch, it's less than a second to snap back. They're hydrated anywhere from 2 to 4 seconds and above. The horse is dehydrated. It's insane the amount of sweat that an animal will lose. You know, when we look at a horse that's doing eventing, say 3 hours of heavy exercise, then they could lose anywhere from 22 to 66 pounds. An endurance horse, 10 to 40 pounds. Thoroughbreds, anywhere from 4.5 to 7 pounds just during training. Ranch work, 10 to 40 pounds, and harness racing, anywhere from 22 to 66 pounds lost just during exercise, and that's losing water weight, and they need to drink that back and replenish those electrolytes. So it's really important. One thing that I emphasized last month as well is you need to take your horse's heart rate, respiratory rate, and body temperature when they're first thing in the morning, they're cool, and they're not exercised. Okay, what is it? What are those normal temperatures? And then once you've ridden your horse doing normal exercise, take the respiration rate, the heart rate, and the body temperature again. So now you have a baseline for what is normal under normal conditions, so that then when it is really hot, or you think, wow, my horse really just didn't recover well today or didn't do well today, and you take those body signs, and his respiration rate is weirdly high, or his heart rate is really high, and his average heart rate for doing this amount of exercise was, say, 30 beats per minute, and today it's 50 beats per minute. I mean, that would be an outlier, and that would say something's wrong. I should potentially call my vet. So don't wait till they're sick, or we've got crazy environmental conditions before you know what these physiological signs are. And don't rely on what your friends' horses rates are. You need to know what your horse's rates are and use those as a guide. Horses may need up to 30 gallons of water per day, depending on heat, humidity, and exercise. So we want to make sure that we offer that to them. Any questions?